My brothers and sisters, heads and representatives of the Christian churches and ecclesial communities and of the world religions, dear friends.
Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Matt for the Remnant Forum. You know, one of the really difficult things about being a traditional Catholic these days is this accusation that's leveled against us. And you know what? It lands. And the accusation is that, I don't know, somehow traditional Catholics feel that they're better than everybody else. We're more spiritual, we're more holy, more Catholic than the Pope, and so forth. And I think that comes about for two reasons. One, I think there's a lack of understanding of the true nature of the crisis. And two, every good, solid, loyal Catholic wants everything to be perfect, wants everything to be just fine, doesn't want to be in criticism of his shepherds or, you know, worried about scandals in the church to such an extent that children are scandalized by priests and bishops and so forth. And it's a really difficult time. And I think before we can come to any sort of consensus as to how are we going to get through what's coming, and I think what's coming is going to be much more difficult than what's already passed. We're heading into a new era now in the church and in the world. And I think in order to understand how we can prepare for this and how we can keep our sanity and our souls in the days and months and years ahead, it becomes very important for us to understand the true nature of the crisis in the church. This is not some small thing. Arguably, this is an unprecedented crisis. Traditional Catholics will readily admit this. Conservatives, and even neo-Catholics will admit there's a crisis in the church. But where there's a real disconnect is in this idea, at least for the neo-Catholics, that there's absolutely no crisis inside the Vatican. That the devil, that the forces of hell have utterly failed to have any impact whatsoever on Peter. And if that were the case, I'm not quite sure how we could say that we do have an unprecedented crisis. Chris Ferrara, I need you to weigh in on this. In other words, if everything is just fine in the Vatican and with Peter, could we say that this is even comparable, for example, to the Arian heresy, where most historians agree Pope Liberius himself fell victim to the heresy of the day?
Well, I'm thinking of Monsignor Gamber's assessment of the situation in his book, Reform of the Roman Liturgy, to which Cardinal Ratzinger wrote an approving French language preface, in which he says, to sum it up in a phrase, great is the darkness that surrounds us today. Where is the new St. Basil the Great? Where is the new St. Athanasius? He said that the modernist heresy has penetrated even into the mysteries of the sacred liturgy. This is a renowned liturgist whose work was praised by Cardinal Ratzinger not long before he would ultimately become Pope. So obviously we're in the midst of an unprecedented crisis, and either we acknowledge that or we don't. If we acknowledge it, then certain things follow. And one of the things that follows is that we have not only a right, but an obligation, I would say, to talk to our fellow Catholics about the situation in the church, to educate them about what is going on, even if that might involve commentary on what the popes have said or done over the past 50 years. And I mean by that negative commentary, respectful but nevertheless strong criticism of the direction in which the church has been taken by the Roman pontiffs as a matter of prudential judgment.
Yeah,
the Pope is just not infallible.
It seems like, you know, so many Catholics nowadays, as I said, partially out of cowardice, I suppose, but I think many more are motivated by fear or by a certain sense of dread, the implications of pointing accurately and honestly to what's been happening for 50 years. But Chris, the thing is, this really isn't a matter of our opinion or our spin or our interpretation of things that we're hearing. Even if you go back a couple of pontificates and move forward, we have heard things as Catholics that no Catholic has ever heard in the history of the Church. You know, I'm thinking of pan-Christian, gatherings such as were condemned by Pope Pius XI and Mortalium Animos. Those are now commonplace. I'm thinking of popes saying things like, may John the Baptist bless Islam. I'm thinking of popes saying things like, yeah, atheists, sure, if they're decent fellows, they can go to heaven. I'm thinking of popes saying, homosexuals, if they're trying to be nice people, hey, who am I to judge? Now, you can argue that all of those things can be justified in according with Catholic teaching on some level, Chris. But I think everyone must, in honesty, just simply agree, we've never heard things like that before.
No, this is just another set of unprecedented novelties being added to the swarm of novelties that has overtaken the Church since the end of the Second Vatican Council. We're seeing one thing after another that we have never seen before. Now, there are two ways to approach this. Just go with the flow, accept it all, and say, well, our religion is not what it was before. It's simply a new religion.
Right.
A religion of openness, inclusiveness, dialogue, tolerance, etc., etc. In other words, Catholicism has conformed itself to the Enlightenment. And the other way is to say, as the popes before Vatican II said, one after the other in complete unity, this modern world is a threat to the integrity of the faith, and the Church must be, exactly what the Neo-Catholics ridicule, a fortress against the errors of the modern world. Those are the two camps into which the Church has been divided. The camp of accepting modernity and going along with what the world expects of the Church today, and the camp of tradition which says the Church can never conform itself to the world. The world must conform itself to the revelation brought to the world by the Church.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and you just wonder what it would take. If we woke up tomorrow morning and read in the newspapers that the Vatican has announced a fourth person in the Blessed Trinity, and you get the impression the spin machine would immediately kick in and they would say, gee, why didn't we ever think about that? Of course there's a fourth person. I can't believe I never thought of that. But it just seems like there's just no line that they won't cross over and accept.
Seriously, I wonder if there's anything that could come out of the Vatican today, if it receives the tacit or express endorsement of the Pope, that certain people would not defend as something that we can now accept as legitimate. For example, there was a blogger whose name I won't mention, who in response to the rumor that the Pope might appoint a woman as a cardinal, was already articulating a defense of this nonsense, saying there's no theological objection to lady cardinals. Oh, sure, we could have 100 lady cardinals voting on who the next Pope will be. What's the problem?
Yeah.
There's really nothing they won't swallow, and so it's a question of the frog boiling in the water and proclaiming that it's perfectly fine to be boiled in the water.
Yeah, no,
the temperature's rising gradually, and I'm being cooked alive, but no problem.
Isn't it great? I love the temperature of the new water. That's great. Yeah, it's like, I guess if you think about the conditioning process that's been going on for the past 40, 50 years, I mean, think about what Catholics have been asked to accept liturgically. And to somehow act like there's continuity between the priest most dramatically of all, turning around at the altar and facing the people, for the first time in a couple of millennia.
Of course, turning around and facing the people is just the same as turning the other way and facing God. It's all the same.
It's all the same. It's all the same. Yeah.
You mentioned something at the beginning, and this irks me no end. This slick cliche, or I should say, the desperate cliche. Oh, are you more Catholic than the Pope? Anyone who has any understanding of the long history of the Church will know, as shocking as this may seem, that in many epochs of the Church, it was really quite easy to be more Catholic than the Pope.
Yeah.
And that's the miracle of the Church, that certain popes whose lives were disgraceful, the Borgia popes, for example, popes who fathered children out of wedlock before they became Pope, popes who bought their office, for heaven's sake, these popes were hardly exemplary Catholics, and many ordinary Catholics were more Catholic than the Pope. This is not about the personal piety of the Pope. The Pope is not the Church.
Yeah.
We don't say that Catholicism is the Pope. No, even the Pope must conform himself to the objective requirements of the faith. He is a custodian of the faith, not its owner.
Yeah, and if you think in terms of living through that, so you would say Alexander VI, well, yes, but he never tampered with doctrine. True, he never did. But imagine living in that era and finding out the sort of Sodom and Gomorrah, bacchanalia that's going on inside the Vatican. That couldn't have been easy. And the example, the moral example of the Pope. Look what's happened to faith in our day since the moral example of the priests in this clerical sex scandal has been so horrific. Many people have simply left the Church. Now, those priests, for the most part, those pedophile homosexual priests, they didn't tamper with doctrine either. But look what they did to doctrine. Look what they did to the Church's teaching in the minds of the people who had to see that example.
Well, and now we're seeing popes who are morally above reproach doing things in the pastoral realm with various remarks and gestures that certainly have caused confusion and have undermined the faith, and I have to say it, to be perfectly frank, given rise to this entire Sedevacantism movement. Because Catholics who become embittered by what they see, because of the scandals of the post-conciliar popes, go the wrong way. And they follow this ridiculous syllogism. A pope, in fact, in this they share something with the neo-Catholics. Popes must be Catholic at all times. This pope is not Catholic in what he says and does at all times. Therefore, he's not the pope. Well, the neo-Catholics work hand in hand with the Sedevacantists to produce this outcome when they insist that, by definition, what the Pope says or does is Catholic. And that if he does something which appears not to be Catholic, that causes scandal in the Church, we have to find some way to contort ourselves to interpret it in a way that's dogmatically acceptable or doctrinally acceptable. And, you know, the problem we have here is also really not one of obedience. It isn't as if people who make critical remarks about what's been happening at the Holy See recently are disobeying some command of the Pope. The pernicious aspect of this whole crisis is that none of it has arisen from anything that has actually been commanded of the faithful. These are all things in the realm of the pastoral. These are all observations the popes have made. And these are all novelties which in no sense have been imposed on the faithful. We've never been commanded, for example, to attend the new Mass. We've never been commanded to engage in ecumenism. There's no papal edict saying Catholics must dialogue. All of these things have been conducted in the realm of optional pastoral novelties, and the damage that they've caused is fair game for comment on the part of the faithful. You know, Canon 212, which I think you'll be able to put up on the screen here, recognizes the natural right of the faithful not only to make their concerns known to the sacred pastors, but to make their concerns about the state of affairs in the Church known to the rest of the Christian faithful. And that means in this age of modern communications, through the press and on the internet.
Yeah.
You know, we say it again and again. Pope Francis himself recognized this when he telephoned Mario Palmaro, who, God rest his soul, has since passed away on account of liver cancer, to thank him for Palmaro's very severe criticisms of Pope Francis. And there's some breaking news in that regard. I read today on one of the Italian blogs that there's another pamphlet, an essay in pamphlet form, to which Mr. Palmaro contributed, along with Mr. Gnocchi and Giuliano Ferrara. It was published shortly after Palmaro's death. He was working on that essay, making insertions and corrections up until 3 days before his death. And this is a man facing eternity who knows full well that he's going to stand before the judgment seat in a matter of days. He went down fighting against this problem in the Church. The problem of a pope who just doesn't understand, apparently, that he cannot keep making off-the-cuff remarks, sloppy theological observations in homilies and so forth that are being snatched up by the media all over the world and exhorted to the masses to the detriment of the Church. Palmaro went to his grave trying to combat this recently developing tendency in the Church. Now, if a man in that state of soul, knowing that he's going to be facing the judgment of our Lord himself, thinks it's imperative that one of his last acts be to make this expression of loyal opposition, that should tell us a lot about our own obligation in that regard.
No, that's absolutely right, Chris. And again, we've said it time and time again, Patrick J. Buchanan, who in a sense is sort of, could be argued as an American equivalent to a Sochi or to a Palmaro, he said the same thing. You know, he said this Pope is not saying things that are in violation of doctrine, but they're saying things that are confusing the faithful throughout the whole world. Everyone is admitting this. Now, this is not to ascribe malice to Pope Francis. Maybe he's just still, struggling and trying to find his way as the Pope, and he's trying to see what works and what doesn't work. All the more so we should be critical of some of the things that clearly are not working, some of the things that are celebrated by Rolling Stone magazine and The Advocate. I think it's important for us to let the Holy Father know those aren't working well with faithful Catholics, those things that he's saying. But for just a moment, I want to back up a little, Chris, because I think a lot of our critics, they actually, the ones that are solid, the solid conservative Catholics who understand that there's a crisis in the Church, I think that they know darn well that it's okay to criticize the Pope respectfully when the situation or the circumstances demand it. I think they know that. I think they're pretending not to because they don't want to face the ramifications of what that criticism means in terms of the overall crisis in the church. So I want to ask you, because you've been at this as long as I have, maybe longer, you know, a lot of us have been at it for a quarter century. And a lot of the little things that people now, just after the 7 years, this glorious 7 years of Benedict's reign where we all felt like things were going back towards the right direction, a lot of folks, and I think we're talking probably tens of thousands of Catholics who were introduced to the traditional Mass and so forth during that time period, they don't understand these arguments. They didn't live back in the crazy days of the hippie church of the 70s and the 80s. And I think maybe it's important for us to talk about this just a little more and maybe do a few more shows on this in future. How exactly does the loyal opposition work? And as I say, you're kind of one of the elder statesmen of the traditional Catholic movement. Tell us, what does the idea of loyal opposition mean to you, and how do we put it into play?
Well, this is a matter of right reason and common sense and natural law. The Pope is a ruler like any other ruler. He rules a particular commonwealth, the Catholic Church, a worldwide community of the faithful, and like any ruler, he has the obligation to act in accordance with the common good of the Church. And like any subjects of a ruler, the subjects of the Pope have the right to raise respectful objections when they believe that their ruler is acting in a way that's contrary to the common good. The Pope is not an absolute dictator, and those who treat him as such are guilty of two missteps which are really harmful to the Church. First, they make of the Pope what the Protestants caricature him to be, the absolute dictator. That's the first problem. Secondly, they effectively write the Pope out of the governance of the Church by refusing to confront the problems that we're now experiencing, for example, with Pope Francis. They're effectively saying we don't have a Pope. Let's just pretend he's not doing what he's doing and that he's not saying what he's saying. Let's make no comment on it whatsoever, and we'll just bash the lower members of the hierarchy for doing what the Pope has endorsed or done himself. So essentially, they're saying we have a rudderless church. How is that not de facto Sedevacantism? They want to live as if we don't have a Pope who's causing problems, and that the problems caused by the Pope are not at the heart of the crisis which has confronted the Church since the Council. Let's face it, what the popes have authorized, tolerated, or done themselves has caused the greater part of the confusion that now afflicts us, and the lower members of the hierarchy are following the example of the Holy See.
Okay, hold that thought for just a minute, because I want you just to expand on that a tiny bit. Isn't it actually uncharitable to go after the bishops for doing what the popes are either authorizing directly or permitting and tolerating through example? Isn't that actually uncharitable to go after the bishops, the subordinates, for merely doing what the boss is doing?
It's not only uncharitable, it's intellectually dishonest. And that dishonesty is exacting a terrible toll on our ability to resist the crisis. It might be said, well, what good does it do to criticize the Pope? Or how are you contributing to a solution? Well, if you're going to make that argument, don't criticize any member of the hierarchy for anything he does. Remain mute in the face of one abuse after another, and let the whole Church sink into a morass of pastoral, disciplinary, and doctrinal problems. Say nothing, do nothing. Of course, the constructive aspect of criticism is that you're bringing these problems to the attention of the other faithful. You're alerting them to the scandals. You're showing them that there is a scandal in the first place. And the Pope will become aware of these communications among the faithful through the modern social media. And maybe, like Pope Francis, he'll pick up the telephone and call one of his critics to thank him for the criticism.
Yeah.
And to say, as Pope Francis said to Mr. Palmaro, it was important to receive those criticisms. I repeat, the Pope said to Palmaro it was important that he learned of these criticisms through, get this, reading about them in a newspaper. You know, otherwise might never have heard of the criticisms. How many thousands of letters does the Pope get every day?
Yeah.
What chances he's going to read some little note that we send him by regular mail or even by DHL Express overseas? Chances are minuscule.
Yeah.
And also, the very use of public means to communicate a legitimate concern, the Roman Pontiff, increases the legitimate moral pressure on him to respond. There is a form of legitimate moral pressure that can be wielded against any member of the hierarchy, from the bishops up to the Holy See itself, including the Pope, by means of by means of social communication.
No, that's it.
It's perfectly legitimate.
It's perfectly legitimate, and if you think about how many years we've been at this, and what through trial and error, what we've discovered works and what doesn't work. And one of the things we discovered over the years that doesn't work is criticizing bishops, Chris, because the bishops can simply point to the Pope, and they've done it every single time, whether we're talking about Hunthausen or Weakland or any of the baddies, Bernardine back down through to the last 10, 20, 30 years. The last thing that ever worked was criticizing the bishops because they didn't have to pay attention to you. So what did we do? If you think about it, traditionalists gave up on criticizing the bishops 25 years ago. The remnant does not engage in criticizing the bishops. Why? Because there's no point. There's no point to it when all they have to do is say, we're doing what the church is now expecting us to through the hierarchical channels coming from the Vatican. So we had to, you and I, we had to turn our attention toward the Vatican and say, Holy Father, is this true? And that's how we began this polemic with the Vatican, with the Holy Father.
What did the Pope himself say, Pope Benedict XVI, in Summorum Pontificum, that the Latin Mass had been liberated in part in response to the insistent petitions of the faithful. That doesn't mean little private notes. It means a worldwide movement calling publicly for the liberation of the traditional liturgy. And Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope Benedict had commented publicly on this public movement. That's how the church works. People talk to each other openly.
Yeah.
And they air grievances, even grievances respecting decisions of the Holy See, in a public way, in the hope that the Pope, having received this, as I said before, legitimate public input, moral suasion of a legitimate sort, real moral pressure being brought to bear upon the Holy See, will respond to these petitions. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what a family is all about.
Yeah.
The universal family of the church operates at the level of the public. That's the very nature of the church. I don't understand this ridiculous idea that every single member of the hierarchy, except the Pope, may be criticized publicly. And not only that, dead popes may be criticized publicly. What do we hear from neo-Catholics but constant criticism of the reigns of popes before the Second Vatican Council? We hear many criticisms of Pius IX and his unrealistic syllabus of errors, and the fortress church presided over by popes who were afraid of the modern world. So apparently there's a mysterious statute of limitations.
Once it's guaranteed that nothing can be done by criticizing the Pope because he's dead, then you can criticize the Pope. I see. Yes, this is very logical.
It's silly, and it's not even consistent with the obligations of the faith. And obviously, if the first origin of a problem in the church is in the Holy See, you have to make petitions to the Holy See, and those petitions can be made just as publicly as the actions of the Holy See itself. It's simple common sense.
Listen, Chris, I'm running out of time. This is so interesting. I wish we could keep going. I know you're heading off to Milan in a couple of days, so I probably can't catch up to you again until the end of the week. But why don't we just put to be continued in a few days on this topic? Because I think there's so many more aspects of this that we need to discuss, namely this idea of what constitutes loyal opposition. So if I can get you to come back and talk about that, I really want to do that. And then also just to close this program up. You know, there's been an awful lot of sort of back and forth again now over the past year. We're back to the old sort of, circular firing squad among conservative, tradition-minded Catholics. I wanted to throw this at you and just get your last word comment on this. What do you think of the idea? Didn't we see this over the past 25, 30 years where you never really can expect a consensus among people who are in the middle of a huge revolution? Arguably, they're behind enemy lines on a battlefield. Lots of things are not the way they should be. There's lots of concern, there's scandal, there's chaos, and there's fear. So the idea of trying to get everybody to come together and somehow we're all going to find common ground that we can agree on is pretty unrealistic. But it isn't unrealistic to think that what we all want is for an awakening to occur throughout the vast middle, the decent Catholics who are still going to the new Mass and don't know anything about tradition, to sort of raise awareness of the crisis that has hit their church, to try to get them to come, creaking and slowly moving towards tradition. And everybody can do that, whether the Neo-Catholics, the remnant, the folks in the Pius X. We all have our constituencies that we can work with to try to raise that awareness. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's at least a plausible scenario whereby we can talk about strategy moving forward?
Look, if someone doesn't have it in him to say something critical of the Pope publicly, even though half the world is, people from Pat Buchanan to Germain Grisey, I could go on forever listing the names. If that's not your thing, if you feel that's inappropriate, and you want to be, let us say, the internet version of the Wanderer and just blame everything on the bishops, well, at least you're looking at symptoms, and maybe you're looking at localized problems. Which could be resolved at the local level if you pester the bishop enough. Maybe. Okay, that's fine. And that has its place, I suppose. At least these people are acknowledging that there is a crisis of authority. They're just not looking to the ultimate origin of it. Let them do that. But there are others among the loyal opposition who want to put their finger on the heart of the problem. And let's face it, if the principle of unity in the church is wavering, in areas where the Pope is subject to that kind of wavering. We're not talking about dogmatic definitions. And if that wavering of the Roman Pontiff is causing a crisis in the Church at the most profound level, then certain of the faithful who feel that they have an obligation to do so can raise objections to what's going on at that level in the Church. So perhaps in a way we all work together. But I wish those who don't see any basis on which they can criticize the Pope would allow others to exercise their right to do so.
Mm-hmm. That's
so,
it.
We have differing approaches to the problem, but we're all looking at what everyone now agrees, who's not in a coma, is a crisis in the Church.
That's exactly right, Chris. I'm going to let that just be the last word. That's exactly it. And I think the more people become aware of that, the more we can realize we need to pray more and we need to kind of not expect perfection from everyone as far as dealing with this unprecedented crisis in the Church. Have a great trip over to Europe and all your travels, safe travels, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you, Mike.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.